So, good afternoon. We have now the keynote speech by Professor Pippa Norris from Harvard University. Professor Pippa Norris is the co-PI of our project. So she is the intellectual mastermind behind our project. And she will talk about pillars of trustworthiness. Okay. So Pippa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christian. And apologies that I can't be with you in person, but we're right at the end of the Harvard semester. And so we have a number of classes, which is very difficult to get away from. So I hope that the conference is going well and that you've covered many different topics in trust. What I'd like to do is talk about how we think about trustworthiness, which is a related idea, but is somewhat different and gives us a critical edge, both normatively and some ways of thinking about this with new evidence in a way that gives us value added to the existing literature. And it's the lessons for Europe and beyond. So what I'm going to do is cover a number of different topics. And in particular, we'll start with the theoretical framework. What do I mean by trustworthiness? It's a phrase which everybody assumes that we know, but I think is really worth unpacking. And I'm going to use Russell Harding's concepts, which are about rational choice and how we understand this as a principal-agent relationship. And the big question, which I'd love us to explore, and which is going to be the topic for a new book coming out from our project, is whether or not our judgments of trustworthiness is one which is rational, which is informed, which is aware, and which is therefore something which is going to benefit the interests of the principal, or whether it's affective. In other words, it's about how we feel, whether we grow up and learn to trust particular authorities. And it's a big literature. It's the same literature that we can use for things like voting behavior, but it applies it to a new area of work and thinking about trust, not just about how you vote. And then we're going to look at the research design. I'm going to talk about the new TRUEDEM survey, which has been done in 21 countries and which covers many different issues and which has just become available, along with measures, in particular, subjective and objective performance indices. I'll talk about the key findings and the conclusions. And what I'm going to argue as a result of my analysis is that trust in national government, as well as in regional authorities and in the EU, in things like Parliament or the Commission, is strongly and consistently linked with subjective performance evaluation. So that does suggest that there is actually a rational basis for trust. It's not simply what you learn as you grow up. It's not simply the values that you acquire in your community or in your culture. Instead, it really is much more to do with what the authorities do in terms of whether they're seen as trustworthy. And then the next steps. This is still very early, and I'll explore some of the ways that this needs to go much further than the initial analysis. So let's talk about the concepts. And I think, as I said, we're going back to Russell Harding and some of the work by Margaret Weir and others. And what we're thinking about is about trustworthiness, not about trust. What's the difference? Trust is something which you have as an individual. For example, do you trust the police? Do you trust medicine? Do you trust science? Do you trust parties, the particular party you're affiliated with? Do you trust Parliament? Do you trust government? Do you trust the European Union? But trustworthiness is different because it's an informal relationship. It's not about me, it's not about you, it's about us. Where the principal, i.e. it can be a citizen, if you're thinking about politics, it can be a client, if you're thinking about a lawyer, it can be also somebody like a customer, if you're thinking about a large corporation, where the principal authorizes agents, somebody who's going to act on our behalf. And so again, it's about delegating some of your power, delegating some decisions to somebody who may be having certain forms of expertise, somebody who's going to basically be able to work on your behalf. And they're going to act on your behalf in the expectation that the agents will fulfill their fiduciary responsibilities. What does that mean? It means that they essentially work in your interests, not in their own. They're going to be independent. They're going to be serving you, but they have to serve your interests with three characteristics. These are the pillars that we talk about when we talk about the pillars of trustworthiness. One is competency. That's about, do you actually have the skills, the qualifications, the capacity to deliver when you make certain contractual promises? If you go to a barrister, for example, are they going to be able to defend you in court? Are they authorized and legally trained to do so? Do they have a good track record on that? Integrity is another related value, and that's whether they behave ethically, honestly, and truthfully. For example, when a politician makes a promise, or when a party publishes a manifesto, is it something which they're going to be essentially honest to the public about, or are they going to make magical promises about what they can deliver? And then they have to be impartial, meaning, again, that they serve the interests of their client. And so they have to put aside their own interests. Now, are there certainly inevitably some interests? Yes. Politicians need to have votes in order to get back into office. Lawyers need to have fees, and so on. So everybody has something they're going to get out of a relationship. But in their actions, they have to basically serve the interests of their client rather than simply taking the fee or pocketing the money or acting in ways which are in other ways nefarious and ways to enrich themselves at the expense of those they're meant to be serving. And so it's this phrase here, promises made, promises kept, that is quite common. You say you're going to do something, you have to be able to deliver. And why is this important? Why am I going on about this concept? Quite simply, that trust normatively is often assumed to be good. We talk about building trust. But if you trust somebody else to act on your behalf, a leader, a party, if you're basically trusting your fate to a doctor or to science, like a vaccine, you have to know that it's going to actually serve your interests. And so judgments of trustworthiness, particularly when they're accurate and informed, minimize the risk of relying on demagogues who are going to make false promises and who are going to say that they're going to reduce inflation, they're going to create security, they're going to improve your standard of living while corruptly lining their own pockets. So if you're not rational, if it's simply affect, your feelings towards a leader, your feelings towards a party through party identification, your feelings towards an authority, but they don't behave in the ways that they meet these three ethical criteria, then of course your interests are going to fail and they will benefit. So those in authority always want to have your trust. Everybody wants you to go along with them. Why? Because it increases their legitimacy. Putin wants people to be able to trust him in Russia. President Xi wants people in China to trust him. Americans are thought if they can trust their president, then they give him legitimacy. And they also have benefits because it allows delegated representation. Everybody in Parliament, for example, everybody in the legislature acts on your behalf, in which case, again, you can think about representative democracy, and you also have accountability in hierarchical relationships. So if somebody has more power than you, more influence, then what you're doing is you're giving up some of your power on the grounds that they're going to serve you. And it's also thought that trust is very important in the whole tradition, which is created by my colleague Putnam, to facilitate social cooperation. If you trust other people, your neighbours, your friends, if you trust people who are horizontally equal to you, you get collective action. You might join a trade union, you might join a cooperative, you might be part of a green movement in collective recycling, whatever it is. If you trust the other people in your community or in the group, then you can act together. So if you trust and it's affective only, it may be accurate, it may not. If, however, you trust and it actually is true that the agent is competent, has honesty, and is going to act on your behalf, then you can rely on this relationship and you won't be swindled. They won't take your money as an investment banker and run off to the Cayman Islands. Instead, they will actually invest it as you want. So it's an important relationship. It is the part of society and it's part of all hierarchical organizations. Now, if we understand that, how do we think about how you arrive at evaluations of trustworthiness? So this is the core model, which we're continuing to refine and improve. It's a parsimonious model. It's fairly simple, but we hope that it really gets at the core relationships. So judgments of the agent's future trustworthiness. Again, think of this like, for example, do you trust the police? Do you trust a party? It could be either individual or an individual actor or a collective agency, judgments are going to be based primarily on two things. One could be a rational evaluation of their past performance. For example, if you trust the Social Democrats, or you trust the Law and Justice Party, if you trust a conservative Christian Democrat, or you trust a Green Party, what have they done in the past, particularly when they've been in power? What have they said? What do they stand for? And the more informed you are about what they've done in the past and how they've worked and whether or not they've fulfilled these three criteria, the more that you should trust them. But of course, things which have happened a long time ago in their past record might not be what they stand for now. There might have been a change of leadership. There might be a change of public policy and how they compete. So you always want the more recent information, not going back so far, so it's current. So what have an agent done in the past, and can we trust them today based on that? But also, it might be that in fact it's your affect, it's your feelings towards them. Everybody grows up in a particular culture. If you grew up in Sweden or you grew up in Italy, you might have a very different view, for example, about how far you can trust the police, how far you can trust a handshake for a relationship, or whether you need a formal contract. How far you feel that you can trust any authorities which are in your country, how far you feel you can trust the European Commission, in the European Union. So you grow up and you learn trust from an early age, who to trust, not to trust. Your parents will give you some cues. They might say you should trust the clergy in your church, in your religion, or you should trust teachers in the school. And then as you grow up, you continue perhaps to have those same affective relationships, and they don't necessarily update. So you get them from socialization, your school, your community, authorities within your area, your neighborhood. And so somebody who grows up, for example, in Sweden might have very different views about what's trustworthy than, again, somebody who grows up, say, in Spain or in Greece, irrespective of how they're performed. Now, all of that might be affected by, as you can see, two other factors: cognitive skills. Somebody with more education, knowledge, and interest might have a more accurate view of the current performance, particularly when things change. For example, if a party has been in power for 4 years, what's been their record? Most people don't pay that much attention. They might look at the pocketbook economy. They might not actually read the record that clearly. If we were to ask people, for example, on the street, what's been the record of unemployment in the last 4 years, or inflation? Has crime gone up or has it gone down? Has the country become more secure or more vulnerable, for example, to terrorist threats? Most people will give you an answer, but whether or not it's accurate would depend on their knowledge, how far they follow the news, how far they're interested in these events, and of course their broad cognitive skills. But also, it's not just an individual level. Your information environment is able to affect you. And in particular, when you think worldwide, if you live in an open society and you have many pluralist forms of information, and you can basically sort through and hear both pros and cons. For example, if you have many newspapers and television stations, some of which are favouring the government, some of which are critical, then you get different sources of information, which allows you to make more accurate judgments. If, however, you live in a closed society, for example, there's censorship on the internet, and there's state-run media, and there's limits on what independent journalists can say, then of course you might have a very different way of judging, in particular, those in authority in the government, their leaders, or the major party. And so that is going to limit how you can actually be critical and be able to balance up different types of information. If you only are in a media bubble, that's a problem. But on the other hand, if you live in an open society, you're more likely to be having access to plural information, for example, in online sources. And all of this matters for, as I said, the two different aspects, which are the consequences of trustworthiness. How far do you go along with the authorities? For example, with rule of law, do you obey the law? Do you believe that it's legitimate? Do you think that the law is there to benefit everybody? Or are you going to basically not pay your taxes, even though you're legally entitled, obliged to do so? Or you won't go along with the authorities in other ways. For example, if medical authorities say you should have COVID restrictions, or you should have a vaccination, but you don't believe in science, and you don't believe in the medicine, then you will basically reject it for yourself and your child. In addition, as I said, collective action requires accurate judgments of trustworthiness. You can join a group. Is it actually going to benefit you and your community? Or is it going to basically be one which is there just for the leaders and for whatever power they are able to get? If you join a party, if you join any sort of interest groups, if you join any sort of protest movement, is it one which is going to actually be able to deliver? Is it one which is going to actually be able to be one which is trustworthy? Or is it one which is going to be problematic? So that's the model. How do we start to think about it? Well, if we do think about it like this, our judgments of trustworthiness are going to be understood in this typology across the top. Am I negative or am I positive towards the agent's performance? Do I have confidence in them or not? And then down the side, you've got what's the actual performance of the agent? Is it positive or negative? By these criteria that we talked about. Does the government, for example, bring down unemployment? Does it actually deliver public services? And so you get these four categories. And we can have rational trust. That's a case, for example, where the government is effective, it's positive, and the public is positive towards it. And you can think of many cases in the Nordic area, which obviously have very strong confidence, for example, in the Reichstag, but also have very strong confidence and a very positive public administration tradition. On the other hand, if the government is negative in what it does and the authorities are corrupt and they're basically seeking their own power, but not really serving the public, then you should have rational mistrust. And you can think of all sorts of cases of that, where the government fails to deliver, it's ineffective, it's corrupt, and it's basically full of self-seeking politicians who don't serve the public. So mistrust, if it's rational, is in fact the best strategy. You don't want to have mistrust when it's misplaced. Now, we have these other two categories. On the one hand, we're always talking about cynicism. And that's where the agent, the authorities are positive in their actions and in their performance, but the public is not believing it. They're cynical and they mistrust, therefore. And a clear example are those like vaccine skeptics who say that if we take vaccines for children, it's not going to actually prevent diseases. And cynics can be accused of really having problems for society and for their community. For example, I've just heard that the number of measles cases in Canada for the first time has really reversed sharply. Why? Because people aren't taking the vaccines for the children in the schools, and therefore the whole community can suffer, a whole country can suffer. And the opposite is credulous trust. That's where essentially we find that there is a negative performance by the agent, but a positive reaction. And a classic case of that, I'd argue again, could be seen for a case like Russia, where the public, if you look at the polls, if they're to be believed, about 80% say that they support Putin and that they have confidence in his leadership. And yet, of course, as we know, through the invasion of Ukraine, tremendous problems for the average recruit to the army and to Russia in terms of its international reputation across the world. So credulous trust is where you trust the untrustworthy. And we don't need to go all the way to Russia. I'd argue in America right now, a lot in the MAGA movement who believe, for example, that January 6th was full of patriots and that it was a movement which was democratic, are very credulous because the leadership is telling them that, even releasing the J6 perpetrators. But of course, it's false. If one looks at any of the information available about the events of January the 6th and the insurrection on the Capitol, where policemen were killed and where there was a tremendous threat to American democracy. So on a operational basis, how do we measure this? What we need is two sources of information. One is how much does the principal, i.e. the average citizen, or any other relationship, how far do they express feelings of trust? Are they negative? Are they positive? And then on the vertical index, you need to know what's the actual performance or the subjective evaluation of their performance. So we need indicators matched to things like survey data in order to operationalize this and determine who in a particular country is a rational truster, rational mistrust, and which citizens can be seen as cynical mistrusters or with credulous trust. And there are many challenges about this. And in particular, we're always measuring, ever since the civic culture, our subjective trust, our feelings of trust, but we need to work out whether or not that relates to performance. And then that means on what issues are they important to the public? Are they purely subjective, in which case we're in a bit of a hall of mirrors, or are they objective? They're independent of the survey. So you can look at things, for example, like economic performance by GDP. Has it risen? Has it gone down on a per capita basis? And then see whether or not most people feel that the economy has got better and that they trust the government's handling of the economy. But of course, there are many issues that the government will work on. Maybe the public feels more strongly about the environment or immigration or other issues, not necessarily the economy. So matching the two is theoretically challenging, but all political economists are obviously very much working in this area. And we do it all the time in terms of decisions to vote. So what we're doing is we're extending those methods, and we have a range of performance indicators now available to the application to trust rather than how did you vote. So here's the research design. And as you can see, this is the TRUEDEM survey, and it's a whole range of different topics that we gathered information on. And it's got all sorts of issues of social and political trust. I'll show you those, trustworthiness, but then a range of other issues as well. And it's just become available to everybody within the TRUEDEM project, but it will be released in public as part of the deliverables of the TRUEDEM project. So any of you can also have a look at the data. Some of the questions are ones which are standard, and so we can check their robustness against other sources like the Eurobarometer or the European Social Survey. Some of them, however, are innovative, and so we can start to think more afresh about these relationships. And these are the measures of trust. And we ask people quite simply, how much do you personally trust each of the following in your country? And what I'm showing you here is the factor analysis. In other words, which items of trust in our survey go together with which other items. We've dropped the coefficients which are too low, and they come out in a fairly intuitive way. So whether or not, for example, you trust the Commission in Europe is related to whether you trust the Parliament and the Council, somewhat less at the United Nations, so that forms the international institutions scale. Political institutions is the next one. As you can see, lots of different agencies, the government, Parliament, heads of government, political parties, regional government, elections, head of state, and the courts. That's another dimension, and I'll focus on that for the analysis, but clearly anybody can look at the other dimensions, which is an important area as well. Civil society are things like the church, the labour unions, the banks, very important, and a whole literature, particularly, for example, in organisation theory and in those focused on political sociology and the sociology of the community. And then we've also got social trust, which can be for the out-group, for example, people of another religion or another country, and the in-group, like your neighbours and your family. And again, an enormous literature on social trust, but that basic distinction is really important, because you might well know personally all of the people who are part of your in-group, but for your out-group, that's obviously maybe a strong predictor on things like support for populist parties. So what do the factors look like? And here is just the descriptive pattern in trust in national political institutions. So it's all of those items about the government at various levels, and it first just looks at the countries who are in the survey to see what the pattern is like. And these are always in traffic light colours, meaning that dark green is the highest level of trust across each of these institutions in a 100-point scale. And then, as you can see, those in red are the countries who have the most problems. And I think there's a clear pattern, which has always been there in every other survey, which is that it's a north-south. It's a Nordic versus Mediterranean culture in Europe. And it's also, to a lesser extent, an east-west. So clearly, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, have lower levels of trust. Hungary, And what you can see, by the way, for Poland is always very interesting, because Poland now, according to this, is in some ways one of those bridging countries, but it's more in the north and therefore closer to Germany and Latvia and Austria, according to these categories, than it is according to some of the countries, for example, in the Balkans. And again, it's not simply an East-West relationship. France, in this particular period, and it was asked in 2025, so it's current, is low trust, and Spain is low trust as well. So there are variations across the world and across Europe. And what we've got is two other measures, which I'm going to focus on. One is our questions about how we value process performance. By process of performance, what we mean is those ethical standards which I outlined in our conceptualization. So we ask people these different 5 questions. Is the government competent? Does it act in the benefits in the interest of all citizens? Is it free of corruption? Is it open? And is it inclusive? And a 5-point scale. So we can combine all of those. They come together in a single consistent scale, which is highly reliable. And we can turn that into a 100-point scale. So my first bet, my first hypothesis, is that the more that you evaluate positively the way that the government works, then the more you're likely to trust it. And that would be a rational assessment, but limited in its test because, of course, it's again attitudes compared with attitudes. But also it might be that process isn't that important. It might be that you judge a government on what it does, on its policies. And here we've got some questions which are about how far people feel that the national government has performed well on a wide range of different issues: healthcare, standard of living, security, and so on. And these 11 issues also can be summed together. They form a policy performance index, not just a process performance. And again, it's a consistent scale with our 30,000 cases. So we can look at the performance of the government as well. And it might be that, again, you feel that you don't know much about what goes on in your capital. You don't know much about what happens in government ministries, but you can judge things like, has your standard of living got better or worse, you and your family? Have people in your community had more jobs, or has there been higher unemployment? Has it reduced crime or not? So it's a different way to evaluate the government, but one you can argue is equally important. Now, what do we find? Well, I'm going to give you a series of different data visualizations just to show you. And the first thing, which you can clearly observe here, this is the evaluation of how far the government is credible, has integrity, and is impartial. That's the process performance. And immediately you can see there's a strong relationship. Across the bottom is how far do you trust government? And that's the 4-point scale. And then on the vertical is how far do you believe that the national government has been positive or negative according to these basic principles. And so a country like Sweden, like Denmark, like the Netherlands and Ireland comes out very high on all of those values and on both relationships. However, we also see that a Greece, a Slovenia, a Romania, a Bulgaria comes out very low. And again, Poland, for this particular group, is actually very positive. It's in the middle. It's not the highest, but it's nevertheless there with Finland and Austria and Belgium and Germany, Lithuania and Estonia. So the idea that all Eastern European countries or all Central and Eastern European countries have a problem because of their past experiences under the Soviet era is not the case. Things are mixed. You can get a newer country, a newer democracy, which has higher trust than, say, a Spain or a France or a Greece. So again, that's an important lesson from what we're finding. And the relationship can be broken down. So we can look at the evaluations of the process and the trust in political institutions, and it's a linear relationship, broadly speaking. There are a couple of bumps here and there because of the number of cases and so on. But again, you can see in nearly every country, as people's evaluations of the national government goes up and becomes more positive, so their trust in political institutions goes up. And not only is it clear in a systematic way for the national government, this also works for the European Parliament. So we have a similar evaluation index for how well does the European Parliament work? Again, is it competent? Is it effective? Is it one which has integrity? And again, you can see the higher the level of positive feelings towards, positive assessments towards the Parliament, the more people trust the European Parliament. So it's not simply at national level, and it's also there at regional level. This is subnational. This is the nuts 2 level. And again, we can see in all the different areas, again, a little bit of volatility, but not that much, that the more that you trust, the more that you have a positive view about how they're working. These are local or regional governments, and therefore we can see the relationship. Now, are there differences across countries? There are, in terms of things like the level of trust, but nevertheless, the relationship holds. And this is what it looks like at regional level. And we're innovative in the sense that most studies have really focused on the national or the supranational European level, but we're going to also be able to look at the nuts 2 level. And what the advantages are, once we merge a range of different data sets, is that we can look at the performance of the government at local level, the regional authorities. What, for example, has been their record on education? What's been their record in terms of per capita GDP or other indicators like healthcare? And we can match that to how far people feel that the regional authority works well. And it gives us much more nuance as well. So we can see in some countries, for example, in Sweden, there are differences. It's not that every single country has necessarily got a positive relation. Every single region has a positive link. And again, we can see differences within Poland and within, for example, Italy, just like Bob Putnam always argued about local authorities and regional authorities being quite different in their performance. And we can see that, of course, in also a federal country and a decentralized country, such as, for example, in Spain. Very different in Aragon, for example, to some of the other areas there in the north. And the trust also varies, just like the valuations of performance varies. So again, that gives us opportunities. And it is interesting that, for example, Bob Putnam years ago would talk about how trust was varied in Italy between, for example, Lombardy and Sicily, Milan and Rome. And it's exactly what we observe as well, that again, there's a big difference across Italy in its different local areas, just as there is in other parts of the world. Some places are more uniform, according to our data, but nevertheless, in many places, we see interesting variations, and that gives us new ways of exploring these issues. And this again just shows us the relationship broken down. And it does require us to think about each of these different countries, as well as each of these different authorities. And we need to match that to things like what are their powers and responsibilities, and also what's their government, who's in charge in local authorities. Is there, for example, Social Democrats or Christian Democrats, Conservatives or Labour, Populists or Greens? And we'll have to work out how that relationship might mitigate some of these patterns that we're seeing here. There is a spread across the line, but again, what I've done is added those labels. So in some regions, like in Budapest, we can see, in Corsica, we can see that there is what I would term credulous trust. In other words, trust is higher than performance. In some regions, like in Hamburg or in Normandy, there's cynical mistrust. In other words, trust is lower than the performance warrants. And in other cases, they fall roughly along the line. And so we can see, again, in Zeeland, for example, or in Groningen, home of VDEM, that there's a high level of trust and a good performance. And in some places, things seem to be pretty bad. And so we need to look at what's happening in those cases as well, and in what's happening in terms of local authorities. And policy evaluations are also strongly related to trust in national political institutions, just like process performance. This is the evaluation of how well the government has done on things like unemployment, security, healthcare, etc. And again, there's a nice relationship. And of course, it's tighter at national level that's to say the deviation across the line, than it is at regional authorities where you get more variation. But again, a very strong relationship as a linear relationship, 0.71. So that's a strong correlation. Now, all of this, you might well say, needs some controls, which it does. And so what I've done here is a simple linear regression. I've put in those two core measures, which is the policy performance and process performance. Those are the first two things. And then my dependent variable is the scale of trust in 8 national political institutions. And I've got a range of controls which start to get at the affective relationship, along with some demographic controls. It's not the most sophisticated model. I can think of a lot of other controls we could include. We can explore this, for example, by coding party and partisanship. I would expect that those who are supporting a party in government would have higher trust than those who are in opposition. I would expect that other factors like the type of media you are looking at could well have an impact. And it could be that other things might be equally important, but nevertheless, as a model, what do we find? It's a first step. And you can look down the beta coefficients to see what it is, and along the significance, everything is significant except for left-right ideology. And now that's interesting. You might have thought that, in fact, those on the left will be more supportive and will be more trusting of government than those on the right, because of the traditional view that those on the left want a larger role for the state, those on the right want a smaller role. But no. Liberal conservative, however, is related where people place themselves on a 10-point scale, but that's negative. Again, there's some interesting questions, what's going on there? But the rest, let's focus on the key things. After I've controlled for all these other factors, what's the relationship of the two core subjective evaluation scales? And they're both strong, and they're the strongest relationship in this model, and they're highly significant. And so that basically confirms, even with our controls, that it's not education or income or age or gender or interests which is driving this, it's actually attitudes. The problem is, of course, that you might say, well, yes, but subjective evaluations, of course, people are going to have attitudes which are congruent, which are consistent with their trust, because they're two sides of the same coin. So you can say what we need is obviously not subjective evaluations, but objective indicators. And that would be where we're heading in terms of the next stage of the analysis. This again are the predictors of trust in that model, just displayed visually, between more trust on the right, less trust on the left, by the strength of the coefficients. And again, you can see policy performance and process performance are very important, along with education and income. Interestingly, again, gender is negative. So that's an interesting phenomenon, along with liberal conservative, and that can be unpacked in further research. So the conclusions and implications, and the questions which I'd love to hear from you. The conclusions, quite simply, number one, trust is consistently linked with subjective performance evaluations across all levels of government that we're looking at. And that suggests it's fairly robust, that it's a reliable measure. I can test it in lots of different ways with lots of different controls, and it still holds up. But I can't claim what the direction of causality is. Now, what do I mean by that? Quite simply, that of course, the better that you evaluate your government, the more you might expect people to have trust in their government. But of course, it can go the other way. We all know about motivated reasoning. We all know about the ways in which your opinions and your attitudes will give you a rationalization. So it could well be, if you say, yes, I trust the government, I also feel that they are performing better. And I can't cut the direction of causality through observational data at one point of time. Even though I have lots of units to compare, I can't determine that. And the role of affective feelings and contextual cues remains underspecified. So here what we need to do is do things like control for the party in power, winner and loser effects. In other words, is your party in government? Ideological attitudes more generally, and cultural values. For example, how do people feel about democracy? How do people feel about post-materialism or other types of cultural values? What's their media environment? And in particular, their both freedom of expression and things like the media system, which people are exposed to. For example, does it favor one party or another? And then how much an individual is exposed to different types of media. For example, social media or traditional newspapers, television news, and whether it's on public or commercial channels. All of those things might matter. This is just a first step, but it's an important step. The next part, the next stage of the analysis, is to compare the impact of objective indicators, by which we mean things like the Eurostat official statistics, which give us some indications of, in particular, policy performance. For example, the number of hospital beds or doctors in a particular region, or how far unemployment statistics have come down in the last 5 years, or how far inflation has risen. And we also need to have some process performance indicators, which are external to the survey. Those are more difficult to get, and we can basically use some, however, things like corruption indexes, which can be looked at through regional analysis. And we can also replicate these findings. We don't need to be limited to the data. And particularly if we want to look at some trends over time, the main thing would be to look at the ways in which there's been a change either in levels of trust or in levels of performance. By breaking this down and looking at time series data, such as that from the World Value Survey, from waves 1 to 8, where we have consistent countries, then we can actually start to say if performance suddenly goes down, for example, there's an economic recession in 2008, is it the case that trust follows? Or is it reversed so that trust goes down and then we see changes in how far people evaluate the performance? And then the last thing to do is obviously to examine the consequences of trustworthiness for citizen compliance. For example, are people more willing to pay taxes and to obey the law where they have high levels of trustworthiness? We have measures of that. We can ask about your participation in protests and demonstrations, or how far you're engaged in conventional forms of participation, for example, party membership. And we can look at the broader consequences for liberal democracy. And just the big picture on liberal democracy, what we can see certainly is that trust and your evaluation of your government, where that's positive, we see that that tends to be more common in the long-standing Western liberal democracies. This is the VDEM index of liberal democracy. But we can also again see, which I find very interesting, that it's not simply the length of time a country has been democratic which predicts this. Again, some of the middle countries there, you see Estonia is next to France, Latvia is next to Spain, Lithuania is next to Portugal. Poland is a bit of an outlier, and again I'll go to our Polish colleagues to think about that. It has a higher evaluation of the government than it does have levels of liberal democracy in 2024. But nevertheless, we can see there is a big pattern. And again, Hungary under Viktor Orban has the lowest levels of democracy and also the lowest evaluations according to our survey data. So the next stage is a book that we're editing and planning, and that will continue. We have a number of excellent authors in our lineup, and we go through each of these aspects from the theory and the measures through to performance, affect, partisanship, group identities, ideological biases, cultural values, and then the implications. So I look forward to getting your questions and hearing from you, but I hope that this gives you some idea about what's been going on. Christian, back to you.
Thank you, Pippa. Thank you, Professor Pippa Norris from Harvard. She is the principal investigator of our project, Trust in European Democracies. Now we have a discussant, Dr. David Tarachik from the university as a discussant, and afterwards we have Q&A.
Hello, Professor Norris. Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you, yes.
Thank you very much for a very detailed and inspiring presentation. I was able to look at your presentation beforehand to create some questions and comments, and I tried to structure them in a way that would be meaningful, both, I think, for the immediate discussion, but for the group as well. And many of your comments in the presentation actually provided context to the questions I have. But nonetheless, I think the 5 points or 5 questions I have perhaps could be of some use. The first one, I really enjoyed the conceptual distinction between trust and trustworthiness. I think that's a really important component. And your model of trustworthiness, of competency, integrity, impartiality, obviously makes sense and is rooted in the strong literature and political science. The question I have here, or maybe a comment, the rational evaluations of the agent's performance is a complicated issue, I think. In this, I'm thinking about Hannah Pitkin's work, and specifically the difference between the delegate and the representative. And if we think about a delegate who we give much less freedom to, we have much less trustworthiness towards that person. That creates a set of specific hypotheses to be tested and set of specific expectations. If we talk about a representative, we give that person more of a benefit of a doubt. As you note, under conditions of uncertainty, dynamic change, we trust that person will do the right thing for us in a dynamic environment. I think that would matter a lot for the model, your predictions and your potential hypothesis that you could test, which direction that this would go. My second question or observation is also related to your findings. As you noted, trust in regional, national, and European government is strongly and consistently linked with subjective performance evaluations. And I'm just thinking about the role of the media and the average citizen in each of the countries that we're looking at. So if I'm an average citizen, I understand much more that the local park that was built will be of the use for me immediately. If I think about the national government, and the tax cut I'm receiving in January is going to kick in later on, but I will still feel it. But it's much more complex with the European Union, right, where the funds start to trick in and the bridge will be built, but in 10 years. How do you see the role of the media play in that dynamic, right? And I think this would matter a lot. If I'm listening, as you've alluded to media that's very critical of the European Union, because of my party affiliation, I think that changes or at least affects the dynamic. I was just curious to get your thoughts on that. The third question I have is more about research design and maybe the theme that you also underscored in your presentation about the need of objective evaluations. It's very interesting, and I guess I'm asking if you could maybe speculate a little bit about that. You started to do that in your presentation a little bit about what measures could be implemented here. But it's interesting because if the objective and subjective measurements align, then citizens are actually quite good at evaluating performance. If they don't align, perhaps they're uninformed or they're even irrational, right? If we're going to focus on the rational choice model. And I'm also thinking about the comment that both you made today and Professor Christian Belzo in the morning about the left-right distinction, or that class is not really driving statistical levels of trust in the models that we're looking at in the data set. And the one thing that really comes to my mind here is the groundbreaking work by Catherine Kramer-Walsh, right? Putting inequality in its place, where she looks at region class consciousness at the group level. I'm thinking about our focus groups, and are there any potential data sources there to see if people have identity that's actually hidden from statistical indicators, so to speak? It's an identity that people use to evaluate how well the government is doing. I don't know. That would maybe push your project a little bit in the context of mixed method design. But if that identity is working in the background, as with the voters in Wisconsin who would benefit from Democratic government, but they actually don't vote for these Democrats because they see them as the source of their ills, that also explains a lot. And you know, this leads to the second difficulty that you've mentioned in your presentation too. It's difficult for citizens to evaluate how well the government, the politicians are doing. We know that from the context of American politics, right? So American presidents are notoriously rewarded for good economic performance and penalized for bad economic performance, even though they don't have that much to do with that. I'm not saying they don't have any influence, but that influence is actually I think less tenuous than average citizens would be willing to admit. And this also connects to the issues of, and maybe you could talk about that, potential exogenous shocks, right? Like we've had COVID, we had war, all of these things impact not just economic performance, but how people evaluate that economic performance. Is there a way to accommodate that in your model potentially? And my last question or observation would be related to your comment about causality, that it's still underspecified. And I'm specifically thinking about the work of one of your colleagues who's in this project, Mark Hetherington. The standard model that I think the orthodox model that we have working in political science is that bad performance leads to dissatisfaction, leads to bad evaluation, so to speak. But I'm guessing, would you be open, or does it make sense to treat trustworthiness as an independent variable here, where low levels of trustworthiness breed dissatisfaction and bad performance evaluation no matter what you do, or conversely, high benefits of trust, right? High levels of trustworthiness lead to higher satisfaction regardless of the mistake that the government or the politician would be making. In that sense, it's a very exciting project. I very much look forward to see how this work develops. But once again, thank you for awesome presentation, and I will get it back to our moderator.
Thank you very much. Pippa?
Yes, so that's such an excellent range of questions, and it's particularly valuable because, as I said, we're about to start work on the new book. The data, in the ideal project, you start with your survey data, and then you run your 3 years of your project, and then by the end of it, you've finished. But the way that it's evolved has been a benefit because we have been able to include questions as we've gone through the other discussions and so on. But we're still a work in progress, and I very much look forward to the next stage. In terms of the concepts, I think you're right that essentially we have been somewhat asleep at the wheel in the empirical work. The theorists have moved ahead. The work on trustworthiness started basically with the Russell Sage Foundation and became very popular in the early 90s. But we are still in the empirical work, often focused on, in particular in political science and in sociology, on survey analysis, which is about the individual level of trust without necessarily bringing in the political economy focus on performance plus trust. And economists have always looked at this, but they've looked at it from a dyadic relationship where they've got an experiment in trustworthiness through game theory and things like that. That's great. But of course, you can't generalize to a experimental test in Berlin to assume it might work in Paris or let alone in Warsaw. So the trustworthiness has always been there, but we haven't actually taken it up as an empirical community, I think, and we need to really take that up much more. And the idea of delegates and representatives having different roles, yes, that's true. And so we need to think about that. But also, of course, there are many other ways in which government roles are going to be varied from one place to another. So concepts, for example, of consensus or consociational democracy versus majoritarian democracy have within them embedded different normative standards about what the government is meant to do and how they're meant to perform. And we can think about that in terms of our comparisons across different countries, although we don't have as many majoritarian democracies as we'd like in our comparison, because we didn't include the UK, but we have got France. And there are various other institutional contexts which allow us to think not just about the individual, which has been the focus of so much research, but the individual in context. And that multi-level analysis is incredibly rich, particularly when we get to regional government. Because again, we can think of regions which are governed in coalitions. We can think of those with a single party in control. We can think of those with different types of powers, for example, over healthcare or education or economic development. And so there's lots at the regional level, which I hope will be able to bring in some people who are first class at understanding how regions are governed, and be able to basically get at some of those broad issues about institutional context and then the response of the public. In terms of the areas of how we think about the question of rational voting, rational trust, it's the classic question of how do you think about rational voting? It's exactly the same challenges. So it's not simply enough to know how the government has performed on X, Y, and Z. We also need to know that that issue is important to the person, that it's salient. For example, they could have done brilliantly on science and technology, but if somebody doesn't care about that, but they care about prices and job and inflation in the shops, then it won't be relevant for how they judge that government, right? So we have to think about the salience of the issue. We have to think about what people might know about that issue. And some issues are going to be easier to judge than others. So how well is security in Europe being strengthened by the new, for example, German defense policies, or about the investment in new technologies like drones and so on? Nobody knows that in terms of the average voter. But you can think about things which are on your doorstep, which you find every day by going to the shops and seeing the prices rise. So again, you've got to have saliency, and then you've got to have awareness of those issues, that people care about them and they know something about them, and they're not simply relying on some vague notion. And then also we want to know what the media is doing. Now, the problem with the media is that we do have in our surveys, what media do you look at and how often? And so we have frequencies of exposure. But of course, unless you actually map that to something about the media environment, meaning media systems, and pluralism in the media, for example, in your local city or your local community, do you have 2 or 3 or 4 different newspapers with different political persuasions, or do you only have one? Do you have one local government, local television station, or do you have many? Do you have public television with that tradition of balance, or do you have commercial television that might have very little news in it at all? So again, we need to use things like some of the work of the Euromedia Group and some of the other work which is being done on how media systems are differing from one place to another, not just at country level where we have too few cases, but of course at regional level as well. And again, by that mass individual linkage and multi-level analysis, hopefully we can get at some of that. But really what you need is obviously experimental data, where you actually expose people to different types of messages about what the government has done, and then see whether or not people's trust changes from pre and post designs, or changes always different across the different groups after exposure to different types of messages. But again, doing that on a cross-national basis is incredibly difficult. You can do it in cases. I've done some of that work years ago myself, but it's very difficult to do across 21 countries, very expensive and complicated in various ways. But I think we can do something there. On objective evaluations, again, it's a question of issue voting models. And ever since Phil Converse and all the work of the American voter, we've known that issue voting and rationality in issue voting continues to be a question of debate, and what cognitive skills you need to actually make a rational vote. And so we can again take from that literature, but then apply it to trust and hopefully get some of that purchase from that. Class or education, they're so closely related. I didn't look much at the occupational groups and so on that we have in the survey. And we also have educational levels, and education was a control, and it's an important control, and it's an important factor, but I didn't break it down by different levels of class as well as by education, and other factors like immigration status, or household, your type of household, or children of marital status, a whole range of different demographic factors that might be important to how people judge these things. But again, we can do that as the next stage of the research. And in particular, your social identity, I very much do believe, should play a big role. And that's exactly why we've got a couple of chapters in the book planned on how your partisanship and your social identity and your ideological skews should influence how you trust the government, or you trust other agencies, and how far you trust how far you evaluate them. One thing, for example, we have a nice measure on populism, battery, and we also have party vote, which I didn't use so far, but I'm matching that to other data sets. So the best way to do this is to do multi-level. And in fact, we're going to have not just one individual level data set, but 3 or 4. So I've matched it already to things like regional indicators from the nuts level data from Eurostat. I've matched it to party. We've got how are you going to vote in the survey, and I've matched that to my global party survey 2019, which gives us party family. And again, that's wonderful because you can look at whether Christian Democrats or Social Democrats have different views on these items, and you can get at some of the classic questions there. And then I also match it to national level data sets on things like the quality of government from the University of Gothenburg. And again, that allows us to look at 1,001 different indicators. But again, the challenge is to say which indicators are most important to look at. I can throw it all into my mix and basically, see what spits out, but that's really not what it's about. It's about thinking about what the public might care about. We do know there's a relationship between, for example, corruption in a country and levels of trust. That's well established. But what about things like government efficiency or measures of rule of law or measures of levels of public participation? I mean, there's so many different indicators. We need intellectually to do that work to say what's going on there. And in terms of the president or the government getting credit for a good or bad economy, we know that that's the case, even though they have very little control. But on the other hand, there are certain issues. Ideally, what you want is something about the manifesto which the government is standing on, i.e. what are they promising to do, and then what's been their record in office, in which we can actually evaluate what their performance has been through some performance indicators as well. And think about exogenous shocks, but not using our own data because you need time series for that. So again, what I would assume is that when you get an exogenous shock, which is something like the invasion of invasion of Ukraine, or the asylum and immigration crisis of 2016, or the 2008 economic shocks of the Euro crisis, that there will be a change in the level of trust. But I'm not sure that these relationships would necessarily be altered by that. They're a kind of acid test if the government is blamed for those issues. But if both things go down, both trust and your evaluations, then the relationship holds irrespective of the shocks to your system. But again, I think we can play with that. And these ideas can all be transferred across to the European Social Survey, which is the best for those sorts of things, 2002 right through to 2024. And of course, to the wonderful Eurobarometer series, if we can find suitable elements on a biannual basis that we can monitor and the changes over time. Those are the best things to look at that through a longer period. And the world values from 1981 for those countries which we've had throughout. Causality, yes.
Can we come to an end, please? Can we come to an end?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
We need Q&A. Sorry about that. Apologies.
No, you have a last word, Pippa, and then we have to close the session, please.
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pippa. As you know, she is a spring of ideas and next books and next projects. We have about 3 minutes, 4 minutes for questions. And please feel free to ask questions. And also you can make some response if you wish, David.
Hi, Pippa. Good to hear you. Full of energy, as always. Just a minor comment. In one of your regression results, you commented with a little bit of an expression of surprise about the direction of the signs of two coefficients on the individual level. The one was the left-right, and the other was the conservative-liberal. They both had a negative sign, if I recollect that correctly. My understanding was that this means that if we go to the market cleavage, leftist people are less trustful, and on the cultural one, liberals are less trustful. I didn't find that very surprising because I think on both cleavages, the liberals on the cultural side and the leftists on the market side are the ones who want to change the status quo. So these are the agents of change in the society, and for that matter, I would think they are notoriously more dissatisfied with what is going on, even if their own party is in power. But this is just an intuition.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Pippa?
No, absolutely. So we can explore that further, Chris, and hopefully in your chapter. So we can think about cultural values and the way that shapes all of these issues.
Why not?
Why not?
Thank you very much. So we have now 3 minutes for the general audience. Was a bit much, I know. Maybe the discussants want to have a final response? Or? No?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Norris, for clarifying all these issues. I guess I have a more general question, and if you could, we also had a couple important politicians here and influential public figures. Based on the research that you're carrying out, what would be some practical things that could be implemented in the life of politics as it's currently standing in European Union? We have a lot of students. I don't know if you can see them or not, but many of them are thinking about going into political activism, already are doing that. So I'm trying to maybe bridge some practical lessons from the current research you're doing to them.
Yes, I mean, the policy relevance is really the critical issue. And the main thing, I think, is simply that a lot of the work that we're doing with recommendations focuses on the citizens. So somehow the citizens are to blame if they have low trust, and it's somewhat passive and uncritical. When you live in America right now, or you live in some of the countries which have got democratic backsliding, you realize that the problem is essentially with the power of the authorities, and that they're not effective because either they are themselves not leading up to high standards of impartiality, they're corrupt, and corruption has really expanded enormously in the American situation in recent years, or they're dishonest and they say one thing and they stand on their head and they say exactly the opposite. And again, the treatment of the January 6th is the classic case right now. Or there are problems of how far they're actually open in terms of the policy performance, because we don't even have right now the basic statistics of the economy, because the government's been out. So I think we need to direct our attention as a community not so much to changing the government, changing the citizens, nor even to increasing participation. Participation isn't the problem, basically, nor is inclusion. It's really about how can you make a government more transparent, how can you make the government more honest, how can you make them more accountable, how can you make them more credible. And I think that things like watchdog organizations and accountability are absolutely critical. For example, is the legislature actually able to hold the government to account through committee hearings or through other independent measures? Are there media watchdogs who are looking at, again, coverage in the media? Where is it effective? Where is it not? How far can we think about anti-corruption commissions, independent commissions and so on? How far can we think about institutional reforms to check the power of the executive? My current book is about the cultural roots of democratic backsliding, but it really argues that we need much more effective democratic governance institutions in countries which have often been asleep at the wheel. They haven't necessarily been changing their constitution very, very fast. There have been all sorts of rigidities and inflexibilities in the constitutional arrangements. And it's only if we can break down some of the current problems and really address them seriously that will actually increase the trustworthiness versus the trust. And you don't want the public to be trusting if the institutions aren't working, because you're creating a kind of a passive citizen who just goes along. And remember that trust is about power. It's not just this nice, fuzzy kumbaya feeling. Trust is where you empower somebody else to do something for you. And if they're not trustworthy, and again, I think the liberal bias in academia is a fundamental normative problem, particularly in empirical political science, which kind of inherits this rather cozy view of trust from the 1960s. But when we apply it today, we need to be critical. I have argued that now for like 50 years or whatever, however long it's been, ever since I wrote about critical citizens. And we nod, and we say, yes, that's true. But in practice, we always say, well, how do we improve the trust of citizens? And I think we just need to reflect on our own values and the values in that statement and say, well, mistrust is fine. Mistrust is not a problem if it's based on a poorly functioning government or poorly functioning authorities in other ways. And we need to improve the authorities.
Pippa,
I know we have to finish, right?
Sorry. As you can see, if you want to be a scientist, we have 4G projects: students, postgraduates, rising stars, and grown-up scientists. So if you fancy this, this is how life looks like for people like us. We have to work a lot and then we talk a lot, because that's it. And thank you very much, Pippa. And David, you have the last word, if you want.
Thank you very much. And in many ways, your comments, I think, goes to both underscore the role of the citizens, but I think also the politicians, right? Many of whom would also benefit from those higher levels of trustworthiness. And I guess I'm coming back to your original quote from the presentation, make promise, keep promise, right? And I think that's good for democracy in general, both for the politicians and the people, as this kind of basis of evaluation for us to critically go forward with our society.
Thank you very much, David. We make the promise to finish in time, and we keep the promise. We finish now. Thank you very much, and you can watch us on YouTube if you wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.